Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Very happy to be here with you. Just returned to Denver from a road trip to Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park. Lots of driving, lots of my daughter's music that I'm not necessarily used to, but had a wonderful time. Happy to be home. Great trip, but always happy to be home and really excited to be back in time to record this for you all this afternoon. So last week, we talked about the arrests of El Mayo and Joaquin Guzman Lopez. And we went through some of the rumors and things that were going on, some things that we didn't know for sure at that point. And then we also talked about what it might mean. I want to follow up on both of those elements this week, in part because there's so much information out there, and yet almost nothing is crystal clear. So in the last day or so, I've probably read, 30 web or newspaper articles about the arrests. There's a really nice breakdown in the LA Times, which I linked to in my newsletter. That may be behind a paywall, though. The New York Times has had some good articles. USA Today has had something, a couple things interesting with Joaquin's lawyer. So I felt like we had to talk about it for another week. What's interesting to me is with all that information out there, there's still no consensus. What do I mean by that? So if we're looking for what really happened, how did the arrest and the whole situation of Joaquin and El Mayo being on a plane in Hermosillo and flying into New Mexico, how did that all go down? There's not necessarily a crystal clear picture, or maybe better said, there are several different versions. First, I want to read a little bit of what USA Today had to say. And I'm going to start with a quote and a series of quotes that come from Frank Perez, lawyer from Dallas, who is El Mayo's attorney, at least up to this point in the proceedings. And here's what he has to say. Some of this I read last week, but I still think it's important. My client neither surrendered nor negotiated any terms with the U.S. government. Joaquin Guzman Lopez forcibly kidnapped my client. He was ambushed, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed by 6 men in military uniforms and Joaquin. After that, Perez said, Zambada's legs were tied and a black bag was placed over his head. He was then thrown into the back of a pickup truck and taken to a landing strip. There he was forced onto a plane, his legs tied to the seat by Joaquin, and brought to the U.S. against his will. The only people on the plane were the pilot, Joaquin, and myself. And my client, I'm sorry. In an interview, Perez said Zambada was meeting someone for breakfast, and that instead of that person showing up, Guzman Lopez and his aides appeared and assaulted him. That caught Zambada and his small security detail off guard, and he was tied up, thrown in the back of pickup truck, and driven 20 miles away to the airport, where he's put on the plane with Guzman Lopez. He was the one who set up the meeting to get Zambada to come out, Perez said of Guzman Lopez. He said the son of El Chapo then personally tied his father's longtime partner to the chair of the aircraft so he couldn't escape. Jeffrey Lichtman, a lawyer representing Guzman Lopez, he also represented Ovidio and El Chapo himself, had no comment on Perez's specific claims. He's free to employ any defense he sees fit to defend against the charges, Lichtman told USA Today. So, you've got that. But then you also have the several reports that talk about the idea that Guzman Lopez had somehow lured El Mayo onto the plane with promises that they were going to go out and look at land, or they were going to go look for an airstrip. And once somebody was on the plane, it went to the United States instead of the trip that El Mayo had been promised. The USA Today article goes on and says they had talked to 2 current and 2 former U.S. officials familiar with the situation. So here's part of what is said in this regard. Guzman Lopez had engaged in lengthy surrender talks with U.S. authorities, as is often the case in these protracted efforts to capture them. But authorities were not hopeful that El Chapo's son actually would surrender. This is important. They were caught unaware when Guzman Lopez sent a last-minute message saying he would be flying to the U.S. airport and bringing the infamous Zambada with him. El Mayo was the cherry on the top, one U.S. official said. It wasn't expected at all. That set off a mad scramble as U.S. agents from the FBI and HSI raced to the scene just in time for the tiny Beechcraft King airplane to land on the runway Thursday afternoon. Interestingly, there's also in this, there's a statement from a local pilot who kind of stood and watched everything as it went down. And remember, there's a video of kind of this transaction as well. The pilot said that one man who he later identified as Guzman Lopez deplaned first. And here's what he says. He shook all the hands of the law enforcement. The man he later understood to be Zambada, quote, remained on board. Obviously, he came out later and was calmly taken into custody, end quote. So you've got a little bit of a question here. Did Joaquin somehow lure El Mayo onto the plane, or was he basically kidnapped? And I think I'm going to tell you my personal thought based on all the information and based on a couple of insights from people who I consider to be extremely knowledgeable about the situation. I don't find the El Mayo was somehow lured onto a plane to go look at land with Joaquin to be very persuasive. That just doesn't, there's too many holes in that story. The idea that El Mayo was essentially kidnapped makes far more sense to me. One of the stories that I've heard is that part of the reason that El Mayo had only a minor security detail with him was he thought he was going to meet with a politician, a local politician. Some have suggested it was a governor. Some have suggested it was a mayor of a municipality. But in any event, it was somebody that was trustworthy enough and who might be offended enough by a large security detail that El Mayo went with only a small group, was then put on the plane. That, to me, makes a whole lot more sense. But we'll have to see how things play out and if there becomes more information. In some respects, I'm less concerned, though it's interesting. Like I say, I spent a lot of time reading different reports just because I find all the little nuances different. For example, there's at least 3 different plane types that have been mentioned in reputable news reports. First one said it was a Cessna 205. Is that right? And then, this one says it's a Beechcraft King. So who knows? But as I say, maybe more important than what happened is why it happened and what it's going to mean. We talked last week about the idea that the removal from power of somebody like El Mayo could create a power vacuum, whether that's a power vacuum within the Sinaloa cartel, in general within the El Mayo group within the Sinaloa cartel, or a power vacuum within the entire cartel network in Mexico, is something that we can talk about. Many people have noted that it was likely that El Mayo had given up day-to-day control over operations to others and maybe had done that years ago. Nevertheless, there is tremendous value to having a well-accepted leader, a longtime leader, somebody that people follow and has a reputation for enforcing certain protocols. So the idea that just because El Mayo was not working kind of on a day-to-day operational level, I don't think should diminish in any material way the impact that could result from him no longer being in a position of power. When talking about this potential power gap, if you will, or power vacuum, I want to refer to two different sources. So in Nexos, which is a Mexican newspaper, and Ileana del Rocio Padilla Reyes, who is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, had this to say, and I think this is interesting. Recent events have shaken the fragile balance. The removal of key leaders creates a power vacuum that can be exploited by others, leading to a cycle of violence and continuous reconfiguration. The policy of decapitation promoted by the United States has proven insufficient to effectively dismantle criminal organizations. Instead, it has led to further fragmentation and an increase in violence. These captures or renditions take place in the context of important political frameworks, such as the upcoming elections in the United States and the need for quick victories by Democrats who've been accused by Donald Trump of being lukewarm in their fight against crime. This political scenario adds an additional layer of complexity to the already delicate situation in Sinaloa, exacerbating instability and making it even more difficult to implement sustainable solutions. She goes on. The recent history of Sinaloa shows that we are at a critical moment. The complex web that has sustained the interdependence between politics and organized crime is being challenged and transformed. In this complex scenario, it is crucial to recognize that simplistic solutions are not enough. The arrest of leaders may seem like a triumph, but without a comprehensive and sustainable approach, these actions can exacerbate instability and violence in the region. The other article I want to read is from the Brookings Institute. And we have referred to articles from the Brookings Institute in the past, particularly Vanda Felbab Brown, who reports and researches a lot on Mexico, has written extensively about Mexican cartels. We've talked about the facts that I don't necessarily agree with everything that she says, but she's got better credentials than I do, and I generally agree with what she's saying. So here's what she says that is very similar in tone. She says, but strategically, El Mayo's arrest is problematic. As I have written extensively, high-value targeting amplifies violence. It encourages infighting within factions of the same criminal group over succession. It brings to the top of organizations more violent leaders, and it stimulates rival groups to attack the turf of the group that suffered the leadership loss. HVT, high-value targeting, rarely delivers the dream outcome of simply weakening criminal groups and strengthening the state. In Mexico, such HVT since the Felipe Calderon administration has produced an out-of-control criminal market. Lopez Obrador made it even worse by coupling sporadic HVT with otherwise giving up on law enforcement against Mexican criminal groups. The HVT-caused violence has been terrible for the Mexican people and ultimately sapped the willingness of Mexican governments to meaningfully cooperate with U.S. law enforcement efforts. Mexico today is a powder keg for such post-HVT violence escalation. Yes, El Mayo, elderly and suffering from diabetes, has allegedly been negotiating possible terms of surrender for U.S. law enforcement for the past several years. He may well have a succession system in place in his branch of the Sinaloa cartel, which could reduce one aspect of post-HVT violence. But Joaquin's betrayal will critically exacerbate the ongoing infighting between the Chapitos and El Mayo's branch. The fighting may also inadvertently increase the power and dominance of CJNG, a far more vicious cartel than even its arch-rival Sinaloa, and just as implicated in fentanyl smuggling into the United States. CJNG will try to take over Sinaloa's turf, and vassal criminal groups from Baja California and Ciudad Juarez all the way to Chiapas and the state of Sinaloa itself. That would be a bad outcome for the United States as well as Mexico. A substantial reduction in the flow of fentanyl and other drugs to the United States is unlikely. Infighting aside, the Sinaloa cartel has redundancy systems for smuggling, and two of the Chapitos are still at large. The way to avoid violence triggering effects of HVT is middle layer targeting that seeks to capture at once much of the leadership layer underneath the top bosses. But middle layer targeting requires a lot of time, on the ground presence, unavailable for U.S. law enforcement under the Lopez Obrador administration, and prevention of intelligence leaks. The latter difficult given extensive cartel infiltration into Mexican security and government structures. Moreover, instead of tactical opportunism, targeting, including HVT, should be guided by strategic decisions as to what kind of shape and leadership of a criminal market or of an insurgent group is least contrary to U.S. interests. The United States should have rounded up Los Chapitos, though they themselves are high-value targets, and gone after CJNG leadership, but left El Mayo at large for a while to stabilize the crime market and relaunch policies relatively less harmful to the United States and to Mexico. Now, she does say that three factors could offset the expected costs of greater violence in Mexico following El Mayo's arrest. The first is that if the United States had intelligence that El Mayo was providing services to Russian intelligence agencies, connections between him and Russian operatives have for 3 years, while Russian intelligence actors have been recruiting criminal groups for a wide range of anti-Western operations across Europe, and their presence in Mexico has also grown significantly. Second would be if there are any linkages between a Mexican criminal group and a terrorist group. Though the United States has looked hard, it hasn't found this before. The third, and by far the most likely factor, would be if El Mayo provided information and evidence on the massive layers of corruption among Mexican government, security, and law enforcement officials. El Mayo has been the corruptor-in-chief. His corruption networks have spanned many presidential elections and administrations from very high levels to municipal governments across the country. If he spills the goods on them, and the United States can indict many more corrupt high-level Mexican officials a la Cienfuegos and actually convict some, like in the case of former Secretary of Public Security Genaro Garcia Luna, that would be a powerful blow to Mexican criminal groups and a big boost for rule of law in Mexico. Okay, all of that I agree with. Let's talk about the latter point for a moment. Does it seem likely to anyone that if El Mayo was kidnapped? So let's posit, or let's posit it this way. Let's assume, which I think is a very safe assumption, that El Mayo did not get on that plane in Hermosillo knowing he was going to fly to the United States and turn himself into the FBI and HSI. So if that's the case, is it likely that having been duped or kidnapped and now brought to the United States, he's suddenly going to decide to spill his guts and tell what he knows about corruption in Mexico? Given his age, given his health? I'm not sure. That seems a little bit unlikely to me, which, if that's the case, one of the bigger mitigating factors from the power vacuum likely to exist once El Mayo is out of the picture, that mitigating factor may not be significant at all. A couple of other things that I think are interesting to talk about at this point. One is, notice the absence of strenuous objections from the Mexican government. Okay. You had, a well-placed, what was he called? The corruptor in chief, right? So if you've got this person who's, let's just say, kidnapped, probably by, or at least ostensibly by Mexican citizens, but kidnapped, put on a plane, and taken to the United States, you would think there might be some type of outrage from the Mexican government, but there's been none, really, even though they've acknowledged that they knew nothing of the events prior to them happening. Number two, is it interesting to anyone else the absence of violence at this point? Shortly after these events happened, there were warnings about don't go to Mexico, be very careful in certain areas. Americans should be careful. We're expecting violence, some type of repercussions. That hasn't seemed to have played out yet. Not saying those warnings aren't good, and there are a number of places in Mexico that I would not go to right now. But those places probably haven't changed much since, a couple of days before El Mayo was taken to the United States to today, or frankly, for that matter, 6 months ago to today. Right? The dangerous places are still the dangerous places. So we haven't seen the kind of violence that you might have thought. Go back to when Ovidio was captured in Culiacan in January of 2023, and the violence that happened for days after. None of that surrounding this event. Let's also talk about CJNG for a moment. Is anyone else kind of perplexed by what is happening strategically in Mexico? And whether this is by happenstance, if this is from the Mexican government's, way of dealing with things, if it's a joint decision between some U.S. elements and the Mexican government. But have you noticed that virtually every high-level arrest in the last couple of years, Video, Anini, etc., have been CDS related and not CJNG? In fact, let me ask you, When was the last time there was a big arrest involving a CJNG member? I submit that's been a little bit ago. So, think about that. Remember, in July, El Guano's chief of security was arrested. So it's not just on one side or the other between Chapitos and El Mayo's group. Somehow, though, CJNG, we haven't seen those type of arrests. I also find it interesting, and obviously I'm finding a lot of things interesting these days, but when we think of succession plans, there has been, some talk about who or what group of people would take over for El Mayo, what group of people might have already been working under El Mayo for the day-to-day operations, all of that. But at least from where I'm sitting, we hear very little of that with respect to CJNG. And think of it this way. When we started talking, if we wanted to talk about CDS prior to El Mayo's arrest, who did we talk about? Well, we could talk about El Mayo for sure. We could talk about El Guano. We could talk about Chapitos. We all know them by name now. We knew their security people, right? El Nini was well known, and others. How many names are out there for CJNG leadership beyond El Mencho? And I bring that up because I think it is going to be interesting. Remember last week when we talked about the idea of stability? If you have one dominant player, that can actually be very stable. It can also be unstable if you have, a dictator is good as long as it's a divine dictator, but if you have two, it's definitely stable. If you have more than two, it becomes very unstable. How are these events with respect to CDS and CDS's leadership? We now have half of Los Chapitos in prison. You got to think the other two, Ivan and Alfredo, are, nervous, reorganizing, trying to, cover their tracks from anything that Joaquin could know, could be telling people. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch and see how much internal division or internal strife there's going to be in CDS, and does that allow CJNG to make inroads in a methodical but maybe less violent way than could be anticipated or than is suggested in Miss Felba Brown's piece? Last week, I mentioned one other thing, and I want to bring this up now again and go through it, not in tremendous detail, but maybe a little bit more than I did last week. So remember last week I mentioned at the end that there were some letters in 2023 from Senator Chuck Grassley to Attorney General Garland, Secretary Mayorkas, Administrator Milgram, and Director Ray about some activities that had happened around the time, or precipitated the letter was, by the indictments of Los Chapitos and members of the Chapitos faction that were announced in April 14th, to be exact, of last year. And one of the things that Senator Grassley was so concerned about was the idea that certain operations had been stalled or otherwise not followed through on. So one of the things that I mentioned last week, he says, based on information received by my office, DEA agents allegedly participated in the investigations, leading to these earlier indictments. And in early 2022, they were instructed by DEA leadership to stand down on efforts related to these cases. DEA allegedly clawed back any DEA evidence supporting these earlier cases, and DEA Chief of Operations Ray Donovan allegedly issued an edict that all DEA divisions were to send Chapitos-related information to headquarters for use in a new Southern District of New York indictment. He then says, towards the end of his letter, Administrator Milgram described the Sinaloa and CJNG cartels as, quote, the greatest threat to Americans, close quote, and the fentanyl epidemic as, quote, the worst drug crisis this country has ever faced, close quote. Nearly 300 people die every day from drug poisonings. Many of them are children. Intra-agency rivalry and career posturing over fentanyl-related enforcement actions is unacceptable and shameful. To that end, please provide the following information by May 22, 2023. So he asked for this information. Please detail how the DEA, HSI, FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office deconflicted the cases referenced in this letter. Please provide all records relating to DEA leadership's directive to withdraw from the earlier cases against the Chapitos, as well as their directive to provide case materials to headquarters. 3, please explain how the Southern District of New York indictment impacted any attempts to arrest or capture Alfredo Joaquin, Ivan, Jesus, or other previously indicted individuals who are named in the indictment. Finally, please identify the individuals within the Justice Department who allowed the DEA and Southern District of New York to spend a year reissuing indictments against the Chapitos when provisional arrest warrants for the Chapitos had already been transmitted to Mexico on the earlier indictments. Okay. So that letter is May 9, 2023. We now get to May 31, 2023. And this is part of what I'd read last week, but I want you to hear it again. On May 9, 2023, I wrote to you about allegations that intra-agency rivalry stopped enforcement against the Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel. My letter requested a reply by May 22, 2023. That date has passed, and each of your agencies has failed to provide me with any response. This silence is surprising, given that high-ranking officials from the DEA and Justice Department spoke to the New York Times about these allegations within just 3 days of receiving my letter. Yet again, your agencies have ignored Congress, their funder and authorizer for Title 21 investigative authorities, but provided information to the media. In doing so, these officials confessed that intra-agency rivalry stopped arrest operations against 4 of the world's most dangerous criminals. Apparently recognizing their actions shocked the conscience, the DEA and the Justice Department felt the need to explain themselves to the press by arguing that all of the districts and agencies agreed to the operation stand down. Even if that were true, it would not justify halting arrest operations for the Chapitos. He goes on to say that by 2019, all 4 Chapitos had been indicted by the Justice Department, and that, as mentioned earlier, arrest warrants and affidavits had been forwarded to Mexico. He then goes on to say, even if DEA's infiltration identified new defendants, DEA cannot argue that arresting the Chapitos would have harmed its operations. If the DEA was concerned that arresting the Chapitos would blow its investigation, then the agency would have alerted trusted Mexican officials, but the agency never sought to stop the Mexican authorities from taking down the Chapitos on their own. If anything, the DEA infiltration must raise considerable issues to the successful prosecution of the Southern District of New York case. The DEA infiltration also reportedly halted arrest operations for the Chapitos on more than one occasion. Listen to this, folks. Records obtained by the Times show that in May 2022, the Justice Department told federal agents to stand down on the arrest operations against Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar at the request of the DEA. Alfredo is on the DEA's most wanted list. It takes roughly 6 months of surveillance and planning to arrest a cartel leader. Federal agents had painstakingly tracked Alfredo to a location in the western Mexican state of Sinaloa when the Justice Department reportedly halted arrest operations. 3 sources confirmed this stand-down order. As a result of the order, Alfredo was not arrested and remains at large to continue flooding the United States with fentanyl. The Justice Department allegedly stopped arrest operations a second time at the request of the DEA last spring. According to the Times, agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Homeland Security Investigations had closed in on the Chapitos brothers. DEA alerted the Justice Department and the operations were called off. I'm sorry, this is amazing. So you had chances to get the Chapitos brothers a couple of different times. DEA, requested that the operations be stopped, and they were. Justice Department officials, according to Senator Grassley's letter, defended their actions to the Times by claiming they merely facilitated a conversation between the competing agencies. A senior DEA official said the Justice Department went so far as to secure an agreement that the prosecutors would not take any proactive measures that might expose the sources working with the Southern District of New York group or otherwise harm the New York prosecutions. Unsurprisingly, individuals associated with the earlier indictments disputed the existence of agreement. The agreement allegedly contained lopsided terms favoring DEA with little consideration for other agencies and districts. In fact, Justice policy did not allow the other agencies to refuse its stand-down order. Tellingly, Justice Department officials and DEA leadership have failed to give Congress the same explanation they gave the Times. Justice Department and DEA leadership cannot invoke department policy to avoid responding to Congress after explaining their conduct to the press. If Justice Department and DEA leadership believe they have told the truth to the press, then they should have no hesitation in providing the same information to Congress. So, what does this say? It means that in the year 2022, 2023, leading up to the April 14, 2023 indictment in the Southern District of New York, investigators had information, relevant information that could have led to the capture of Alfredo for sure and others of the Chapitos, and were called off or told to stand down, even though there were indictments against the Chapitos prior to April 2023. And the clear implication from Senator Grassley's letter is that somebody or some group of people wanted these indictments against the Chapitos in the Southern District of New York for, air quotes, political reasons rather than simply judicial reasons. I bring this up again today in the context of the El Mayo situation, the El Mayo arrest, the arrest of Joaquin, the surrender of Joaquin, and ask what the connection might be. And as I mentioned last week, when you look at the responders who were first at the scene when the plane landed in New Mexico, when you look at who Joaquin apparently had been talking to, when you look at the stories, the New York Times has a couple of pieces about the extended discussions relating to El Mayo turning himself in. There seems to be a separation between certain agencies, HSI, FBI, and the DEA. Is that a remnant of the things that Senator Grassley was talking about? And again, I go back to this idea of a focus on CJNG, a focus on CDS to the exclusion of CJNG. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have the magic answer of how all these things relate, but they clearly are relevant to one another. So, what's the recap here? Well, the recap is we still don't know exactly what happened with El Mayo, but we do know that El Mayo is still in Texas. He's entered a preliminary plea. Joaquin is in Chicago. He's entered a preliminary plea. We know that there is concern about a power vacuum, that we haven't yet seen how that's going to play out, and we probably won't for weeks or months or even years. And we note the unique position now that CJNG is in, or may be in, where systematically over the last year and a half or so, two of the Chapitos are in jail, El Mayo is in jail, El Nini's in jail, and yet CJNG has remained relatively intact. That, to me, is an interesting position. I would encourage you to look in the newsletter for some of the other articles that have talked about this, if you're interested in kind of what other people are saying about the surrender of Joaquin and how El Mayo got here. Next week, barring something fascinating on this situation, we're going to go back and finalize our discussion on the Camarena abduction. Really don't want us to lose the train of thought on that, because I think it's super important with respect to the Camarena case. Obviously, we'll keep track of news events and with respect to El Mayo and Joaquin, and frankly anything else going on, and we'll bring those up as is necessary. Thank you, everyone. I had to rush to put this together after the trip. I hope it was worthwhile. If you have questions, thoughts, comments about this, please let me know. And that is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena for today, and we will talk to you next week. Thanks, everyone.